Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week we're going back to my Lit 101 series, and we're going to take things in kind of a new direction. So I've been focusing on poetry for a while. I wanted to take a step towards epic poetry, which is one of my favorite genres ever, and I kind of dipped into this with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I had a lot of fun with that one. And so I wanted to then move from kind of shorter poems of different genres and start looking at sort of the four big texts of Greek and Roman mythology in epic poetry form. So we're going to start off by looking at the Iliad by Homer. This is one of the oldest sort of Greek mythic text that we have in its entirety, and I'm really excited to get into this because the Iliad and Odyssey are two of like my favorite epic poems ever. After this, I will be looking at the Aeneid, which is a Roman poem that sort of spins off of the Iliad, and then I'm going to be looking at Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is an epic poem that basically tells sort of a whole bunch of Greek myths, but filtered through kind of a Roman perspective, and it's really great too. But we're going to start with the Iliad, and it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, so I've got my notes here because there's a lot in here. So the Iliad tells of kind of an integral moment in the Trojan War, which was seen by many of the Greeks as sort of one of the foundational sort of moments in their history. Now, they did see it as sort of a historical thing, not as like myth. So, you know, they saw that like the Trojan War sort of really happened to a lot of them. There's not a ton of archaeological evidence that the Trojan War actually happened, but it sort of fits into that sort of mytho-historical sort of era. So, you know, we're going to go with it. The version that we're going to read in the Iliad is very much mythology because we've got gods and goddesses and magic and all kinds of stuff. So it's, you know, very much a mythical story. So the Trojan War raged for 10 years between the forces of the Greeks and the Trojans. Troy is located in sort of what's present-day Turkey, and when I say the Greeks, there wasn't like a Greek unified state with sort of like one thing. It was sort of a bunch of different kind of cultures. You've got Sparta, and you've got Athens, and you've got Thessaly, and all these kind of different areas, and there was different tribes and there was different kingdoms all throughout. But this is sort of a group of people from Greece, from kind of different tribes coming together. In the Iliad and in Odyssey, they're sometimes called the Achaeans, sometimes they're called the Argives, sometimes they're called the Danaans. So it's just, there wasn't really a unified term that meant like the Greeks, because they didn't really see themselves as sort of one culture. It was more like a bunch of kingdoms coming together, or a bunch of tribes and kingdoms and clans and things coming together for kind of a common cause. Now, most of the most famous events of the Trojan War, the things that people sort of think about when they think of the Trojan War in pop culture, don't actually take place in the Iliad. So we've got like the Judgment of Paris, the Trojan horse, the death of Achilles at the hands of Paris. None of that happens in the Iliad. It's very much focused on one specific conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon and Hector. So we've got kind of these three players basically, and then there's a bunch of side characters as well. And it's focused on, and you read this, the first word in the original Greek is sort of wrath or rage, and it's focused on kind of the rage of Achilles. And so it's a tragedy that's sort of brought about by human frailty, and the conflict isn't, the Iliad isn't really about the Trojan War as a whole. It's about how Achilles' rage influences one specific conflict that sort of turns the tide of the war and sets things up for kind of the eventual fall of Troy, because ultimately Troy did fall. Now, the Trojan War was sort of a long time coming. There were many sort of mishaps and events that sort of led to it happening. Some of it is sort of ridiculous, and some of it is sort of understandable. So we've got a bunch of stuff happening, and then we've also got the gods and the humans. And so the gods sort of take sides in this war. It's kind of like, oh, I don't know, if it's like they're watching a reality TV show and everyone has like their favorites, and they'll either bestow favor on kind of the people that they like. You know, it's like how people used to like call in to like vote to get people voted off the island or voted out of the house or whatever. So it's very much kind of a contrast between sort of the human characters who are fighting for their lives on the ground, and then you've got the gods who see this all as kind of a game to them. And it's sort of really interesting because whenever we think of, you know, ancient Greece and the way that they saw the gods, there was a lot of respect paid to them, but it wasn't a sort of we trust them to make the right decision. It was sort of the gods sort of represented sort of the unpredictability and chaos of everyday life. And so sometimes the gods were on your side, sometimes they weren't on your side, and it just was sort of, you just make do with sort of the best you can do. And the whole kind of focus was sort of, even though you can't really trust the gods, you have to always act in a way that meant that you wouldn't offend them, basically. So that's why you see a lot of hospitality is really important in the culture, and you see this more in Odyssey than Iliad. But you know, the concept of hospitality, you had to be sort of kind and generous to everyone who came to your home, and you weren't allowed to turn anyone away or treat them unkindly. And it was sort of implied that like if any person who ever came to your house was one of the gods in disguise, if you treated them badly, you would suffer for it. So you had to treat everyone nicely and kindly and be very welcoming and generous with what you had in your house. Otherwise, the gods would punish you for it. And so in this, there's a lot of fighting and conflict happening, and the gods sort of flit in and out of the action. And so sometimes they'll give favor to certain people, sometimes they'll punish a group of people because of a slight, and it might be something like a real slight, or it might be something really petty and small. And that's another thing. So the gods are a really interesting part of the Iliad because they almost seem kind of silly. It very much sort of suggests, if you think about the Hunger Games, which takes a lot from kind of Roman and, you know, Greek mythology and all that kind of stuff, there's this idea of like the people watching from the capital who live lives of luxury, they're looking at sort of these kids fighting each other as just entertainment, and they get involved and they can send gifts to the people they like, but it doesn't really affect them in any way. And so they can be a little more capricious about it, and they are very kind of distanced from it. But when you look at sort of the events of the characters in the Hunger Games who are fighting for their lives in this meaningless blood sport, for them the focus is very much on staying alive and keeping their sanity, you know, while all this is happening. So that's kind of the vibe we get. So we've got this sort of contrast between the events in like Mount Olympus and then the events on Earth. So I'm going to give a quick run through of sort of the major players. There's lots of characters in this, but these are kind of the most important major players in the poem. So first we've got Achilles. Achilles is sort of an anglicization of his name. In the original Greek, his name is probably more like Achilles. There's kind of an extra syllable in there. And in some translations, you'll see his name rendered that way. Sometimes it's ACH, you know, and sometimes it's AKH, you know, so it just depends on sort of how the translator is trying to render sort of the original Greek, if they're going for more of a phonetic or if they're going more for sort of the popular spelling. So that's kind of a small thing, but in some translations you'll see people's names spelled differently. You see this with like Hecabe or Hecuba, which is Priam's wife, King Priam's wife, and it depends on kind of what the translator feels works best for their translation. So anyways, Achilles. He is the greatest hero fighting on the Greek side. He's the leader of the Myrmidons. The Myrmidons are sort of a tribe from Thessaly, and he's sort of leading them. So they're sort of, he has his own sort of squad of guys who are fighting under his kind of banner, and then they are one of the squads of the big kind of Achaean army overall. According to some versions of the myth, Achilles is invulnerable to all harm except for on his heel, because his mother Thetis, who's a sea goddess, dipped him in the Styx, the river Styx in Hades, as an infant in order to render him invulnerable, but she was holding him by his heels when she dipped him in the water, and so his heels are sort of the most vulnerable part. Now, Homer doesn't really address this. He feels a little bit more mortal in the Iliad than in sort of other versions of the story. So at one point he's given sort of divine armor to protect him, but there's not a lot of mention of sort of him being invulnerable himself. He does get injured. So this is another thing with Greek mythology, you know, there's different versions of the story and there is no one sort of perfect correct version. But anyways, Achilles is the hero of the story, but he doesn't really act heroic. He is very much a hero, and this is something that I think people sort of struggle with sometimes, because it seems when you read this at times that Achilles is almost the villain, but he isn't. He's not the villain of the story. He's just a flawed human person, and that was sort of the point. This is about the rage of Achilles, and so it's sort of Achilles has everything going for him. He's heroic, he's powerful, he's fast. He also is he's sort of a gentleman. He's not like what we would think of when we think of like a Knight of the Round Table, because that has sort of elements of like Christian morality and piety sort of baked into it. But he's educated and he's sort of the perfect guy. He's sort of the one that everyone sort of looked up to and wants to be like, but he has some fatal flaws, things like pride and anger that sort of get the better of him. And so the tragedy of the story is not so much it's Achilles being a perfect virtuous hero up against outside odds. It's sort of the battle between Achilles and the worst parts of his own nature, and the things he does well, the things he does wrong, and kind of that's what we're meant to sort of focus on. So Achilles is a really interesting character, but he's not like a perfect hero character who has no flaws, and he's not a evil, chaotic villain who should be sort of shamed. He's a very flawed person, but he was still someone that everyone sort of looked up to. Next up, we've got Hector. Hector is the greatest hero who's fighting for the Trojans. He's a prince of Troy. He is a brother of Paris, and I'll talk about him in a bit, and the son of King Priam of Troy. He's a noble guy. He doesn't quite have the same sort of intense bloodlust of some of the Greeks, and I feel like this means that his ultimate fate sort of feels a little bit more tragic. But Hector is a really great character, because if we're sort of on the side of the Greeks, because Homer was sort of for a Greek audience, and so we were on the side of the Greeks, and you'd think that we would see sort of the Greek characters as the people we're rooting for, and the Trojan characters as the people that were like, boo hiss, they're the bad guys, or they're the opposing side. But Hector is like a really good guy. He's described as being very noble. We even get sort of a perspective shift where we get to see him on his side with his family, and he treats them really well. And at the end, sort of the things that happen to Hector at the end is sort of shocking and horrifying to us. So it's really interesting, and this is very much a cultural difference, because now, even if we have sort of a character who we're meant to root for, even if they're not really a good person, because we see that a lot, there's kind of like the anti-hero or whatnot, but I wouldn't say Achilles is an anti-hero in the modern sense. But we'll have characters who we're rooting for, even though they're doing a lot of damage. I'm thinking of like John Wick, something like that. But rarely will we have sort of an opponent who isn't a villain. Hector is definitely Achilles' opposite number, and he is his opponent, but Hector is not a villain, and he's not a bad guy. It's almost like Homer is saying that sort of there's heroes on both sides of this war, and you're meant to sort of cheer for whoever you sort of like the most, but the tragedy of it is sort of human frailty gets in the mix, because no human is going to be perfect, and no fighter on whichever side is going to be this perfect virtuous person, and so it's their mistakes that lead to a lot of kind of the drama and tragedy of it. So Hector's a great character. He's probably one of my favorite characters in the poem, but he is sort of on the Trojan side of things. Next up we have Agamemnon. He is a king of Greece. He's not sort of the king of Greece. He's sort of one of them, but he's the leader of the Greek forces. So everyone is sort of banded together and he's sort of in charge of the campaign, basically. His brother is Menelaus, who was the husband of Helen. And when Helen fled with Paris, both of whom were already married. Helen was married to Menelaus. Paris was married to his wife, who I think was a nymph. Agamemnon then sort of leads the campaign to get Helen back for his brother, and also as a way to kind of punish the Trojans. So Paris is a Trojan. He sees this whole thing as kind of an insult. Agamemnon is sort of a very flawed character. He kind of comes from this really cursed bloodline, is like the line of Atreus, I think, and just bad things happen to sort of everyone. This is where you get like Clytemnestra and her revenge against him after the war, and then you get Electra and all that, and so he's just his whole family line is just sort of doomed to be just awful. But again, Agamemnon isn't necessarily a villain. He's very much kind of one of Achilles' antagonists in this, even though he's from the Greek side. So him and Achilles are on the same side, but him and Achilles' conflict is sort of what starts the whole thing in the Iliad. But he is sort of a more flawed character than some of the others. Agamemnon's opposite number is King Priam, who is, again, he's not really portrayed as like a bad guy. We don't see a lot of King Priam. He's sort of a little bit more in the background of this poem than Agamemnon is. Agamemnon is very much a part of this thing. Next up we have Paris. He's also called Alexandros, or Alexander, so Paris is sort of one of his names. He's a prince of Troy. He's the brother of Hector, so the hero of the Trojan forces. He's the son of King Priam. His elopement with Helen is sort of the spark which ignited the Trojan War. It's not sort of the first thing that led to it, but he is a very, very important character. He doesn't appear as often in the Iliad, and when he does appear, he's kind of a goofball. He's sort of someone that he's not that much of a heroic, admirable person. We're supposed to kind of almost laugh at him, but again, he is a good fighter, but he's sort of represented by Homer as he's more of a catalyst than an antagonist or anything. So prior to the Trojan War, there was this beauty contest which sort of came about because the goddess Eris of discord chucked a golden apple that said like for the most beautiful or for the most fair into, I think it was a wedding celebration for the goddess Thetis, who's Achilles' mom. So when she was getting married to a mortal human, there was a big wedding ceremony, and since she was divine and he was mortal, there were goddesses there, and the three goddesses, so Aphrodite, Athena, also called Athene, depending on sort of which translation, and Hera were there, and so discord wasn't invited. It's very Sleeping Beauty-esque. And so Eris wasn't invited because she causes discord. So she chucks this golden apple into the thing, and the three goddesses pick it up, and they're trying to decide who it was meant for. And so they choose Paris, and they sort of ask him to decide who is the most beautiful goddess. And they all promise him things, and they I think at one point, I think Aphrodite sort of takes off her clothes and says, like it's very, it isn't really meant to be sort of a fair fight. And they know that sort of whoever he doesn't choose is going to sort of come after him. So it's a really difficult decision. Ultimately, Aphrodite promises him Helen and says, if you choose me, I'll make sure that, you have access to this woman. And it doesn't matter that she's already married or that he's already married, but that's sort of the thing that gets this all going. So of course Paris chooses Aphrodite, and him and Helen run off together. Now he doesn't kidnap her, she goes with him willingly, so that's also part of it. She was married at the time to Menelaus, but she went with him sort of voluntarily, and that's sort of what started the whole thing, because there's this sense, and I'm trying to think, there's so many versions of the story, and I just finished reading Natalie Haynes' book, A Thousand Ships, which is sort of a look at the events of the Iliad before and after from the point of view of all the female characters. And I don't know if this is her invention or if she got this from one of the sources, but at least in her version, which is really good, all the men who are vying for Helen's hand in marriage, they know that there's always going to be so many people who are disappointed who don't get to marry her. And so they made this kind of pact where if anyone sort of kidnaps her away, everyone else who was vying for her hand should then come together to rescue her back. So that way there's no squabbling and conflict between them, because she was apparently so beautiful, everyone was sort of fighting for her hand, and they needed a way to sort of keep people from fighting over who gets to marry her. And so, Menelaus marries her, and everyone else sort of then is bound to sort of defend her if anything happens. And Paris isn't Greek, he's Trojan. And so when he sort of runs off with her, they all kind of come together and they go chasing after her, and that's kind of what starts this. Again, I don't know if that was mostly invented by Haynes in her book. I know in her book she has Odysseus is the one who kind of comes up with the idea, but I think that is part of the story in kind of other versions. None of this is mentioned in the Iliad itself in great detail. It comes from kind of other sources, but I think it's sort of everyone who was vying for her hand is then bound to defend her if anything happens, from anyone else. So they kind of maintain order that way. Anyways, moving on. Paris doesn't show up very much, and Helen doesn't show up very much, but they're very much sort of the catalyst for all this. So moving on, I think I mentioned this earlier, there's also Odysseus. He is sort of he's on the Greek side, he's a king of Ithaca, and he's sort of the smart one, he's the clever one, and he comes up with all the kind of the ideas. He's often kind of the voice of reason in the Iliad. After the Iliad, at the end of the Trojan War, he's the one that comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse and all that stuff. But Odysseus sort of shows up throughout this as sort of the strategist. He also kind of throws a bit of a wrench into things, because we've got Athena really likes Odysseus, but she doesn't really like a lot of the other Greeks because of things that they've done. And so he's sort of the odd man out a lot of times. There's also book 10 of the Iliad where he goes on kind of this undercover spy mission, which is really cool. He's a great character. And then of course he's the hero of the follow-up poem Odyssey, which we'll get to eventually. So now we're going to talk about Patroclus or Patroclus. He's not Patrocles, and I think Patroclus it's kind of correct, but it's not really accurate to how like the original Greek. So you'll see it spelt a bunch of different ways, Patroklus, or with a C instead of a K. There was no kind of two different letters for C and K in ancient Greek, so it can be kind of tricky. But Patroclus is sort of the accepted sort of pronunciation of his name. He is Achilles' best friend, and they've known each other since childhood. He is sort of the catalyst for the events leading up to the end of the Iliad, so he's a very, very important character. Patroclus is sort of a little bit older than Achilles is, so Achilles is a little bit younger than he is. He's not quite on Achilles' level fighting-wise, because Achilles, of course, he has divine parentage, but he's still also a good fighter in his own right. Now, regarding him and Achilles, no one can decide if they were lovers or not. So this is a whole thing, and there's lots of people who like to sort of say definitively for sure they were, and others say for sure they weren't. So it's really difficult. Shakespeare thought they were, Socrates thought they weren't, Plato thought they were. No one is going to sort of come to a consensus. Again, there's lots of different interpretations of the text. There's no sort of one canonical version of things. So there's plenty of evidence to sort of support both sides. But in order to do that, you have to sort of understand ancient Greek culture regarding sexuality because it's different than what we think of today. They didn't have a concept of like a gay identity, like someone wasn't a gay person. It was more like they would do homosexual things, but it wasn't their identity. It wasn't who they were. And obviously there were queer people in ancient Greece. There have always been queer people, but they weren't accepted in the way that we would think of today. So it's very much a case of Achilles and Patroclus probably may have been lovers when they were younger because that was sort of more common, but it was often sort of seen as sort of a thing that happened in one's youth. So it was like a phase a lot of them sort of grew out of. It was kind of what they said. It's like you could have dalliances with other men or with boys, which is awful, but again, it's a different culture. But it wasn't sort of a thing that you were forever. And a lot of them sort of grew up and then they would have wives and stuff. And if there were any sort of queer people in ancient Greece, they would have had to have kept their identity secret because it wasn't accepted as sort of like you couldn't have two men who were married and run a household together openly. That wouldn't have been sort of accepted. There was certainly plenty of art that depicts sort of like homosexual flings and kind of crushes is what we'd think of today, relationships that sort of come and go, very like ephemeral kind of things. Apollo and Poseidon are two that I think of that they had sort of dalliances or attractions to sort of male humans at one point or another. So it's really difficult to sort of talk about because our concept of things is very different than the way the ancient Greeks saw it. And so when you're looking at Achilles and Patroclus, it's very much they were devoted friends, comrades in arms. I think of them very much as like Sam and Frodo from Lord of the Rings, like the best friends in the whole world. They would tear the world apart to protect the other one, but their relationship isn't necessarily like a romantic relationship in the modern sense. Very much kind of an emotional relationship. They do have sort of relationships with female characters, and their relationship is very much one of like deep, devoted friendship. Now, you are allowed to ship them if you want, that's fine. If you're talking about Madeline Miller's book, The Song of Achilles, that's sort of one interpretation of it. I think she sort of misrepresents Patroclus a little bit. But that's okay. It's Greek mythology. There is no sort of one set version of things. And so it's okay to read her version of things. And if that's the version you like the most, that's fine. So there's nothing wrong with seeing them as lovers. And there are probably other myths or other retellings of the story that focus more on that. Alexander the Great very famously sort of visited the tomb of Achilles and Patroclus during his campaign. And it was sort of meant to be sort of a public acknowledgement of his devotion to Hephaestion, who was sort of his lover at the time. And so a lot of people think that they were, but it's not in the modern sense, like a modern relationship between two people. It was kind of a little bit more nuanced than that. But I will say, in the Iliad, it doesn't really focus on that a lot. It focuses on them being very devoted to one another, and Achilles' rage at what happens to Patroclus is very real and devastating and emotional, and so he very clearly cares for this person, but you are allowed to sort of care for your friends. You don't have to be in a relationship with them to care for them. So, I don't think Homer necessarily cast them as lovers explicitly, but other poets and artists have. Shakespeare definitely did, but if we're looking at just this book, they're more just really close friends and very devoted to each other, and they care about one another, but it's not necessarily romantic. So, getting that out of the way, we're moving on. So the way that I'm going to break up these lessons, I'm going to do this in a couple different parts, is I'm going to be focusing on the story of the gods, and then I'm going to be focusing on the story of the humans. I'm not going to do like a full plot breakdown like I did with Sir Gawain, where I sort of went through the plot one plot point at a time. What I'm going to do is more like give readers sort of an overview of the story and look at the themes and the characters and the connective tissue, the things that make it work, the things that make it great. So you can then sort of read the poem yourself with a little more confidence, and you know some things to sort of be on the lookout for. Because it's very much worth reading, and I think more people should read this, but I know it can be a little intimidating because it's epic poetry, it's very ancient, and it can seem a little daunting for new readers. So with that said, I want to talk about translations because there are a lot. There's many different approaches to the poem, and they're sort of aimed at sort of different readers. So if you're a little worried about it being sort of old language or hard to understand, there are different translations that are aimed at sort of the general public, or like more scholarly nerds who are obsessed with the poem and want sort of all the nitty-gritty details. So there's different versions of the story that you can read that appeal to sort of different types of readers. And I will also say that there is nothing wrong with any one translation. There's people online who like to be very judgmental and classicist about this and say that if you read sort of a more accessible translation that you're missing out, and you know it's dumbed down, and it's you know not as good as if you read the difficult translation that they like. And that's silly, because there's tons of different translations, and everyone who does a translation is good at what they do. So this isn't a matter of one translation being better. It's just sort of some are more complex than others, but they're all sort of equally valuable in terms of how you engage with the story. So let's talk about a couple of my favorites. And there's some more that I'm not going to be able to talk about that you can also find. So first off is Richmond Lattimore. Now this is my personal favorite, but this one is very Tolkien-esque. It has kind of older style language. It's very grandiose. It's very scholarly. The way that he translated things was he did a really good job of sort of rendering both the rhythm of the original poem. Oh, there's a cat here now. The rhythm of the original poem, and also the feel of it, and the language of it. So it's wonderful. I really love this one. It's epic and it's gorgeously written, but it can be maybe a little dense if you're not really interested in that kind of thing. This is sort of a nerd approved text, but I love the way he writes. It is sort of an older one. This one came out in the 50s, so like I said, it's good, but if this one seems a little intimidating, it's okay if you don't want to read this one. Next up is Emily Wilson's translation. This one's pretty recent. This one is so much fun. I love the way Emily Wilson translates this. Also, there are videos of her doing live readings of this, both in the original Greek and her translation itself, and it's so good. There's one where she has like a suit jacket on, and then as she's reading, she sort of takes the suit jacket off, and she's wearing a tank top, and she's covered in like tattoos that all have like significance to the Iliad or the Odyssey, and it's so good. She's such a good reader, but she's an incredible scholar and classicist. But these are really accessible translations. This one it's fun. It uses sometimes more modern idioms and dialogues. So sometimes you'll see words that feel not out of place, but feel very modern, words like tote bag and stuff like that. But it's a really fun translation. And one thing that she does really well is she captures the specific rhythm of the original ancient Greek. And so that means that her lines are shorter and has kind of a punchy rhythm. Because of that, she had to kind of not cut out things, but sort of simplify the language a little bit. And so one thing you see in Homer is repetition. And so he'll have like repeated epithets or repeated sections. And in this translation, because the lines are shorter, because they're capturing the specific meter of the original Greek, sometimes she has to sort of modify those repetitions. Some people don't like that, but you know, it's up to you. I still think this is a really great translation. It flows really well. It's a quick read. It's very accessible. And this is one that I think more people should give a chance, because it's just really enjoyable. Next up, we have Fagel's translation. And this one is the first translation that I ever read. I read this in like high school, and I loved it. This one is sort of halfway between the first two that I mentioned. So the lines are longer, and so there's a little bit more detail, but it does have kind of a modern feel. There is still sort of modern language. It's not super archaic and difficult to parse. It's really readable. It's enjoyable, and I think this one is sort of one that a lot of people talk about as like their favorite, for good reason. It's a great translation, and it just moves at a really good pace, and it's a lot of fun. Next up, we have Stephen Mitchell's translation, and this is one that I like, but there's one thing that he does that kind of bugs me, but it's okay. So again, it has longer lines like the first two. It's not like mega modern, but it's modern enough that it's still really readable. It flows well, and I think it's a really good translation. Except he takes out book 10. Book 10 is sort of a side quest, and the way he justifies it is he says that book 10 was something that a lot of scholars believe was added later to the story rather than sort of the original, and so he wants to kind of capture the original story. He does include book 10 as an appendix in the back. He uses another person's translation, so you still can read the whole text if you want. It is all still here, but like I said, there's no real like set canons in like the religious sense of Greek mythology. People were always adding to stories, changing things, taking things out. There's always going to be sort of earlier versions with less detail, later versions with more detail, and it's sort of a feature, not a bug, of Greek mythology, and so it's okay if that book was sort of added after the fact, because it sort of became part of it, because Greek mythology was very much a living, breathing entity. It wasn't a static sort of set thing the way we would kind of think of. If we think of today, a lot of people get hung up on the word canon, which in the biblical sense meant sort of the books that were chosen to be part of the religious texts of like the Bible and the Torah and stuff, and the books that weren't included in that were sort of non-canonical sort of thing. And people nowadays, especially in fandom spaces, they see canon in terms of like the all-encompassing continuity, and so everything has to be in service of maintaining this perfect continuity, and anything that contradicts anything else breaks canon and everything. So canon as a concept kind of bugs me anyways, because a lot of people online sort of have turned it into this thing that just makes them mad for no reason. And so with that said, the fact that he sort of tries to sort of render this in its sort of original form is admirable, and it's sort of an interesting thought experiment to sort of read it without reading the events of book 10. But I don't know, I still like sort of everything that was added to it, even if it was added after the fact. But with that said, this is still a good translation. It's fun, it's readable. I like the way he portrays the gods, and he also did a really great translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is really, really good. So I do like Stephen Mitchell. I think he's great. But just be warned that when you get to book 10, you have to jump to the back to read sort of the appendicized version of book 10 and then jump back into it. So if you're okay with that, it's all good. Next up, we have Caroline Alexander's translation. This is also a fairly new translation. So this is sort of the first translation by a woman, and I'm really enjoying this one. I just started, so I'm pretty early on in it, but I'm really enjoying how this one works. It feels kind of like a mix between Fagles and Lattimore. So it has this sort of epic, grandiose feel, but the language is a little more accessible without being like super, super modern. It strikes a really good blend. It has a really good bounce to it. The lines are a bit longer, and I don't know, I'm really, really enjoying this one. I haven't gotten far enough to say sort of what my overall impression of it is, but this is the one that I'm going to read kind of in preparation for these lessons. So this is kind of my canonical text, so to speak, for these lessons. This is the one that I'm going to be working with. So one more translation, and then I'm going to read some excerpts from each one so you can get a feel for what they sound like. If you don't want to read sort of poetry, like the poetic, epic poetry form, that's totally fine. There is also this prose translation by W.H.D. Rouse, and it's just written like a novel, basically. It takes sort of the original Greek and it renders it in prose form. So each book is sort of each chapter, and it's readable, it's accessible, and because it's not bound to sort of the strictures of the poetic form and the lines, because a lot of times there's like a set number of lines you can have and you can't go beyond that, and so this one isn't bound by any of that, so he's able to give a little bit more detail, a little bit more description of certain things. And so if you want just like a book translation, like a novel translation of the Iliad, this one is great and it works really well. I think there's some others as well that are out there, but read the samples and see which one sort of speaks to you. This one's really accessible. There is an older one, and I think his is prose, by Butler, but that one is very kind of old-timey and stuffy, and I think he uses the Roman names for the gods and the characters and stuff, so like Ulysses instead of Odysseus, and Juno instead of Hera. So, you know, be aware of that. But this is a really good prose translation if you're interested. And so I'm going to go back through all these kind of backwards. But here is what the beginning sounds like in this version. An angry man, there is my story, the bitter rancor of Achilles, prince of the house of Peleus, which brought 1,000 troubles upon the Achaean host. Many a strong soul it sent down to Hades, and left the heroes themselves a prey to dogs and carrion birds, while the will of God moved on to fulfillment. It began first of all with a quarrel between my lord King Agamemnon of Atreus' line and the prince Achilles. So that's the prose version. Next up we've got Carolyn Alexander's translation. Wrath. Sing, goddess of the ruinous wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, that inflicted woes without number upon the Achaeans, hurled forth to Hades many strong souls of warriors, and rendered their bodies prey for the dogs, for all birds, and the will of Zeus was accomplished. Sing from when they two first stood in conflict, Atreus' son, lord of men, and godlike Achilles. I love this one. It's really, really fun. So next up is Stephen Mitchell's translation, The Rage of Achilles. Sing it now, goddess, sing through me, the deadly rage that caused the Achaeans such grief, and hurled down to Hades the souls of so many fighters, leaving their naked flesh to be eaten by dogs and carrion birds, as the will of Zeus was accomplished. Begin at the time when bitter words first divided that king of men, Agamemnon, and godlike Achilles. So, that's Mitchell's translation. And this is Fagel's. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son, Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. So he has a really great rhythm to him. I love the way his sounds. All right, and this is Emily Wilson's translation. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, which caused the Greeks immeasurable pain, and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades, and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds, and so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. And if you can find her reading this, it's so good. She's such a good reader. All right, and finally we've got Lattimore's version. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs, of all birds, and the will of Zeus was accomplished. Since that time when first there stood in division of conflict Atreus' son, the lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. Like I said, this one uses an older sort of rendering of Achilles' name, so it's Achilles. So that's Lattimore. It's a little bit denser, but it flows really well, and it has this grand, epic feel to it that I really, really like. Now, I'd also suggest you check out theoi.com. I'll put a link in the description. This is a really great resource because they have a library of free ancient Greek texts. They've got everything, like fragments of this and that. They've got the Iliad and Odyssey. They've also got like the Argonautica and some other stuff as well. And it's all organized by sort of the year it was written. And it's really, really good. The translations are usually older. They're sort of ones that are in the public domain. So you'll see things from like the early 1900s, 1920, that kind of thing. But if you want to read these stories for free and you don't want to have to pay for anything, Theoi is a really great resource because they have a really good library of just ancient Greek texts that anyone can read, and I think that's pretty fantastic. They also have like citations for where everything came from. So if you ever need to cite any ancient Greek source for like a paper or something, this gives you all the information you need of like who the translator was, when it was translated, all that kind of stuff. So that is a great resource. Check it out. There's good stuff there. It also just has sort of general information on like characters and the gods and goddesses, and has profiles of everyone. So if you need to brush up on who people are, that's a really good site to go to. So that's it for the introduction. This is going to be kind of going on for the next little bit. Next week, I'm going to be doing my March wrap-up, so I won't be doing this, and I'm going to get back to this the week after that. So you have time. If you want to read the Iliad or start reading it, you can. You don't have to. Like I said, I'm just going to ramble about it because I love it. I recently read Natalie Haynes' book, Pandora's Jar, which is sort of an explication of the different versions of the myths that center around sort of notorious women in Greek mythology, like Medusa and Clytemnestra and stuff. And the way that she writes, it's nonfiction, but the way that she writes is so good, and it sort of set me on this like Greek mythology spiral. And so now I'm just going to make this everyone's problem, and we're going to be talking about Greek mythology for the next little bit, the next foreseeable future, because it's a hyperfixation and we're just gonna turn this into something productive. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.